The 10 words, or the 10 principles found in Deuteronomy chapter 5, are really the foundational principles that should form the identity of the whole community. I think from the very beginning, these were not intended to be an exhaustive list, some sort of moral code by which the people might live. Instead, it was really intended to be a way of thinking about life, of framing up all of life in the simplest of ways. In fact, even the fact that there are 10, I think, goes back to just this simple fact that most people have 10 fingers, and it makes it really easy to count them off and remember who we are as a people. Daniel Block thinks that the 10 words are sort of like a Bill of Rights. However, instead of these words protecting our rights, protecting other people from getting at me and getting what belongs to me, really these words seem to protect everybody else's rights. I mean, just think through the list, right? The first several protect God's rights to allegiance, to proper representation, to Israel's time. The next six protect other people's rights, right? A parent's right to respect, people's right to sexual purity within marriage, people's right to freedom from paranoia. And so what happens is these 10 words essentially form an idea of a community that is built upon the foundational grace of the Lord, one that frames up the whole of their existence in order that they might be a people that serves the Lord and loves him and their neighbor. And so I think it helps for us to start in Deuteronomy chapter 5 with how the words begin. It says this in verse 6, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." Right at the very beginning, God doesn't just start with one of the words. Instead, he gives them a prologue of sorts, helps them understand this is who you are, and this is your identity, right? I am the God who went into a different nation and brought you out with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. All of these words are couched in this salvation message. God rescued the people. But it's at this point then we get the first word. Verse 7, "You shall have no other gods before me." And so, word number 1 of the 10 words is just that. No other gods. I think it might help us here to just try to unpack a little bit about what this actually meant for the people of ancient Israel. In the ancient world, people believed in all sorts of different gods. The idea of monotheism, I think, was almost non-existent in the ancient world. What happened is people began to believe that the things that they saw in the world around them were related to the things that were happening in the heavens, this world above. And they began to think that then there were certain gods that were doing certain things associated with what they saw in the world around them. And so they would choose a god and they would worship it, right? And so they might worship this god because they believe that that god helps them to have crops, or they might worship this god because they believe that that god is the god of the sea, or they might worship this god because they believe that that god is the one who helps them to be fertile and have lots of children. And so what you have is all over the ancient world, all over the ancient Near East, people are worshiping different gods in different places. One god might be worshiped here, while another god might be worshiped here. It doesn't mean that the people over here think that this god doesn't exist. It just means that they think, well, that god doesn't really do much for me. I'm sort of out of his territory. And so what happens then is you have this idea that all of these different gods are working. And oftentimes you would have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different gods that you're worshiping all at the same time because you're sort of trying to balance everything and make it work. There's also this sort of symbiotic relationship that exists between the people and their gods. So the people believe that if they make sacrifices and they offer up food to their gods, if they do the right things and don't do too many bad things, if they don't tick the god off, then what's going to happen is the god is going to be fed by their sacrifices. They're going to have something to eat. They're going to appreciate their worship. And in turn, they're going to bless them. So the people work hard here on earth to honor the gods and do what they need to do to feed the gods. And then the god in return showers down blessings on the people and does good things for them. It's into this cultural perspective, then, that Yahweh speaks the first word. No other gods before my face or before me. I don't think what this is saying is God's like, listen, I'm in charge. And even though there's lots of other gods, I'm the most important one. So just make sure that you're leaving some room for me first and foremost. I think instead what he's saying is, you need to understand that I am the only God who works. Something else that might help us here is this whole idea of function. I think in the ancient world, people really believed that in order for a God to exist, in order really for anything to exist, it had to serve a purpose. It had to serve a function. And so gods worked, and therefore in people's minds, they existed, right? If I pray to Baal to bring rain and then rain comes on the land, then Baal is a God who works for me, right? It works this way with all of the gods across the spectrum. Now, I think this is what God is doing. God shows up in the land of Egypt, land of so many different gods. And through 10 plagues, he begins to declare to Pharaoh, let my people go. And what happens? One by one, the people begin to realize in the land of Egypt that this God, Yahweh, is entirely different than any other God that they've been familiar with before. And in fact, at the end of the 10 plagues, right before he sends the 10th one, God says this. He says, over all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgment. Exodus 12:12. I am Yahweh. I think what's happening is God is totally transforming the Israelite worldview. They're coming into this idea as they move through the Exodus experience that God is the only one who works for them. It's not just that these other gods are fake gods. It's that they don't work at all. They don't exist at all. And Yahweh, he alone is God. If the Israelites will accept this perspective, I think it changes everything about the way that they see the world. It introduces this idea of practical monotheism. If all of life is to be lived in relation to the gods, then now everything that I do changes because Yahweh, he is my only God. Now, we talked before about how all of these 10 words seem to connect with other sections within the book of Deuteronomy. So what does it look like for this first word, no other gods, to be played out within the book? Here's where I think it connects with the rest of the book. Since it is word one, then it really starts in this next section just after Deuteronomy 5, and what we might call the temptations of Deuteronomy 6 through 8. What happens here is immediately after Moses gives them the 10 words and sort of couches this in an explanation of what God is doing, he moves on to talk about several different temptations that the people are going to face as they move into the land. Remember, they're just on the brink of the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And he says, essentially, here's 3 tests that you're going to face, 3 temptations as you move into that good land. Here's the first one, abundance. The people are going to experience more abundance, more good, more prosperity than they have ever experienced before. They're going to experience a lot of really good things. And Moses says you have to guard that you don't forget Yahweh. When you live in houses that you did not build, do not forget the Lord. In fact, you need to remember back to your Exodus experience and to your wilderness experience, where you learned that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. In other words, don't let your lack of scarcity in the land lead you to a place where you forget the lessons about scarcity that God taught you in the wilderness. So watch out, be careful for the temptation of abundance. Here's the second temptation, unbelief. As the people move into the land, one other problem that they're going to face is that there are lots of other peoples around them. There are people who worship lots of different gods, and they're going to feel intimidated as they try to move into this land and take it over, right? How could just a small nation like Israel move into this land and really drive out these other people? And I think what Moses is reminding them here is you have to guard against this attitude of unbelief, against getting to the place where you begin to to wonder if God is actually able to do what God says he is able to do. And again, he couches this in their past experience. He says, remember, when you came out of the land of Egypt, remember that time when God parted the Red Sea, and then he drowned Pharaoh's army in more water than you could possibly imagine. Yeah, remember then just a few days later when you begin to grumble in the wilderness, asking if there's any water and why God led you out in the wilderness to die of thirst. It's very ironic as you're reading through the book of Exodus that there's so much water in chapter 14. And then even by the end of chapter 15, the people wonder if God could provide water. And yet he does. 2 chapters later, they do the same thing. They test the Lord, it says, and God provides water once again. So Moses says, as you move into the land, and as you begin to experience difficulties or dangerous situations that are coming before you, don't begin to think, you know what? God's not able to control this. God's not able to help me out here. Instead, what you need to do is just remember his work. Remember how he has worked for you in the past. You don't need him to prove it to you now. You can trust in his character. Here's the third thing, syncretism. Syncretism is the combination of worship of one God with the worship of many other gods. In other words, it's not saying I will not worship Yahweh. It's just saying I will worship Yahweh, and perhaps I'll include some other gods along with this as well. When the people arrive in the land, they're going to see their neighbors, their Canaanite neighbors, worshiping on high places, bowing down to idols, going through all of these elaborate rituals, and they're going to be tempted to want to participate in some of those things as well. Well, maybe Yahweh is God, but maybe I could worship some of these other gods as well, just make sure I've got my bases covered. And what Moses says is, no, you will worship the Lord alone. Him alone will you serve. Do not be tempted to go down the path of worshiping some of these other idols, because you will find yourself absolutely devastated. God has declared he is God alone. So don't test him in this way. So what does it look like then to live out a faith that practices the first word, no other gods? What does it look like to stand in the face of these temptations as the people move into the land? Well, interestingly enough, if we fast forward a couple thousand years, I think what we find is Jesus in the first century seems to stand up and face many of these same temptations. In fact, Matthew chapter 4 tells us that he passes through the water, much like Israel. He goes out into the wilderness, much like Israel. And there in the wilderness, he also faces 3 temptations from Satan. The first temptation in Matthew is that the adversary, the Satan, comes to Jesus and says, turn these stones into bread. Jesus has been fasting. He's hungry. And yet, Jesus says, listen, I don't need to prove that God is able to provide. I don't need to do what you say just because I'm hungry. It's almost as if Jesus is saying, I've learned what it means to live in scarcity. I've learned what it means to live in abundance. And I trust that man does not live on bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. In fact, Jesus quotes from this section, Deuteronomy 6-8. The second temptation in Matthew is where Satan takes Jesus up on the temple. And he says, throw yourself down and prove to everybody that you are the Son of God. It's sort of a strange temptation, throw yourself off a building. But I think really at the heart of it is it's this he's getting at this desire to prove that God does what God says God will do. He wants Jesus to sort of force God's hand to say, demonstrate to everybody that you really are the Son of God. You could see how this could be a temptation, right? Well, if I just did this, Jesus might think, everybody would know. Everybody would realize that I am who I say I am, and that God really is who he says he is. But Jesus, he's learned from the history of Israel. And he says to Satan, he says, listen, do not put the Lord your God to the test. He will not listen to the temptation of unbelief. He quotes actually from Deuteronomy 6-8. And then for the third temptation, Satan shows him the kingdoms of the world. And then he says, If you'll just bow down and worship me, all of these things will be yours. Again, this feels like a strange temptation. Really? You're asking Jesus to worship Satan? Surely that's bound to fail. But I think the idea here is, you know what, Jesus, I will give you all of these things. Look at all the power that could be yours if you would just worship me. And I think Jesus's response shows that he's learned the lessons that Israel was supposed to learn as they moved into the land. And he says, no, I will not bow to you, Satan. I will not fall prey to the temptation of syncretism, but instead, I know I worship the Lord and I serve him alone. Again, he quotes from Deuteronomy 6-8. I think we're intended to see this connection here. If Deuteronomy 6-8 is really sort of an exposition of the first word, no other gods before Yahweh, I think maybe as we then begin to listen to the word, as we try to shema the word in our lives, even now, I think we can ask some of these same questions. So what about you? Do you struggle with abundance? Maybe you've experienced a lot of abundance in your life and it actually has led you to a place where you've become more greedy or you've become less satisfied with what you have. Perhaps this abundance has led you to begin to forget Yahweh. And so maybe you need to spend some time over the next few days just meditating on God's goodness, the lessons of scarcity that he taught the people in the wilderness. And you need to realize Yahweh is Yahweh alone. Maybe also you struggle with unbelief. I don't know what this looks like for you, but maybe you wonder if God actually is going to do what he says he's going to do. Will he fulfill the promises that he has committed to fulfill, or will he ignore them altogether? Is God really God? And as you go down that road, you have to be careful that you don't fall into the trap of unbelief. And then finally, syncretism. I don't know what this looks like for you. Maybe sometime during the week you find yourself praying to another God or somehow worshiping another God, but maybe it's more implicit than that. Maybe it's not so much that you would outright pray to another God, but the demonstration of where you spend your time, how you spend your money demonstrates that there's other things in your life that are more important to you than Yahweh. And so let me just encourage you, spend some time meditating on this and thinking through, how can I be a person that honors the first word? That in my life, it is clear that I worship Yahweh and Yahweh alone.